Hello, everyone. A bit of a different video today. Well, if you're watching the book channel, you're really like, oh, the book channel's finally revived. I know I say that every time. But today we are interviewing Brian McClellan, the author of the new series, the new book, In the Shadow of Lightning, which is, what is the overarching series that you're going to be naming this for?
This is Glass Immortals.
Glass Immortals, the Glass Immortals series. I've been lucky enough to read the full book and quite enjoyed it. You gave me very generously an early copy of it, but I know it came out yesterday as we record this, right? June 21st?
It did, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Well, before we get into talking about the book itself, I'm sure some folks that are more familiar with my stuff haven't had a chance to read your stuff before. They might be a little interested in what else you've written in your background. So if you want to go ahead and lay that out for us.
Yeah. So people may have heard of me if they're fantasy readers, they may have heard of me through the Powder Mage books. So I wrote a series of 6 books. That was basically my whole career to date. And it's basically about a world in which an epic fantasy world that's about 1800s technology. Uh, Essentially, my exploration of what happens to a fantasy world when the technology advances, the political and the kind of socioeconomic everything kind of moves forward towards a more modern time period. And what happens when you start having guillotines in the mix with sorcerers and wizards and all that kind of stuff.
I've heard people refer to that type of genre is flintlock fantasy. Do you like that term? Would you describe it as flintlock fantasy?
I do like that term. I use it quite a lot. It's a good term for that.
Yeah. No, I really, the first time I ever heard that for that, I was like, okay, that does a really good job of summing it up. You've written a slew of novellas as well, I believe, that go along with that universe.
I have, yeah, yeah. It's I realized at some point that especially epic fantasy readers, they love getting into these big, deep series, like massive. I mean, Wheel of Time, right? Like
Right.
that's like the quintessential epic fantasy for kind of the modern reader. And I realized that I also enjoyed writing these little stories, kind of off the side of my world, and so yeah, I've got. I think I'm at 5 or 6 novellas and a handful of short stories for Powder Mage. And they're just side adventures. They're something that's not necessary for the main series. But if you like exploring, your characters' backgrounds and things like that, it's fun little adventures on the side.
And we should say we're not going to get into any spoilers for either series, but I will probably ask a couple broad questions about how they kind of interrelate or some of the connections that I've seen between some of the characters. But going a little bit even more broad and more about yourself, you are one of the many authors that I know of that live in Utah, and you're part of this whole crew. Like a bunch of you guys are friends. So I don't know. I think people that are familiar with my stuff know that Mark Zimmerman and I frequently talk about Brandon Sanders and stuff. I know you're pals with him. I've seen you on his show. He wrote great on the cover of your novel, which is, I'm sure, always a good thing. But yeah, I mean, what is this kind of collective of you that's all in Utah? How did this come about?
So it's funny just because I'm actually one of the few kind of outsiders because I'm not a Utah native. Kind of Utahns, I guess, to put it succinctly, there's a lot of fantasy fans in Utah and a lot of people who really like to write. And it kind of it kind of happened before Brandon, but Brandon kind of made it a thing. And so you got Brandon's almost like the center of this kind of Utah crowd of writers, and because I moved here a few years back and I went to school here and I had known Brandon before, so I kind of got pulled into that group, and I'm friends with several of them, and they're all great people, all great writers, but it is a fun, weird little kind of clique that you don't get in many other locations.
Yeah, no, I mean it's I'm continually discovering that yet another author that I read is in that area and is like part of your guys' crew, if you want to describe it that way. So it's always fun to chat with one of you. But regardless, let's talk a little bit about the book. So this is a brand new series that you are writing. And if you want to give us kind of the overview of it, or a brief description of the major characters and how the world is built out, that would be great.
So this is a world that, if people are coming from my Powder Mage books, it'll feel familiar because it's set in something that's technologically similar to our early 1800s. But that's going from there. It's quite a bit of a different world. I wanted to play with an industrial magic. So what happens with a fantasy world when magic is made rather than like an innate or learned thing? So I have this thing called God Glass, and it is created by magical engineers, and these little tiny baubles that will accentuate certain aspects of a person depending on the materials made that are used to make the baubles. And so you wear a piece of wit glass if you need to think better. You wear a piece of forge glass if you need to be stronger or faster. Daze glass if you want to get high. Muse glass if you want to kind of get your inner artist out. There's a god glass for everything, and this material basically makes the world go round, kind of like how we would think of as oil. Um, and so this is a fantasy world in which magic is made, and our main hero, is a guy named Demir Grappo, who is a failed child prodigy who has been in self-exile for the last decade or so. Um, and he finds out that his mother has been murdered, and he has to return home and take his place as patriarch of a tiny guild family, and finds out very quickly that the material used to make magic is running out, and everyone behind the scenes is panicking like crazy, and everything's about to fall apart, but the rest of the world doesn't really know it yet. And that's kind of the basis for the book. And we've got Demir looking for revenge, but also trying to save civilization, essentially.
So that's the main premise, and we've got a magic system that's based out of kind of the use of glass. It's funny because as I was reading it, I was thinking about what it must be like to be a fantasy author these days, because I feel like there's been, in the past maybe even like 2 decades, a really big push towards a lot of like hard magic systems.
Mm-hmm.
Magic systems where it's like, okay, this magic system uses this or this, and I wonder if, similar to the conundrum that is happening in the book, if there's also a bunch of fantasy authors that are running out of I'm wondering if you're like, okay, we can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. Glass. No one's done glass yet, because I read some of these books and people are pulling colors. They're like, this is light. This is based off of words, or this, or this, or this. And so, how did you arrive at glass? And is it a situation where you start to think like, oh, this would be a cool magic system, and then dang, somebody else like publishes something right then and there?
I mean, you do get that because you want it to be unique, and you don't want to even inadvertently rip somebody off. But there's the problem, like, so when I first came out with Powder Mage, my whole pitch for that was, like flintlock rifles, advancing technology and magic and everything. And I thought that was very unique and cool. And my agent and my editor told me that it was very unique and cool. And then, like 3 months after Promise of Blood came out, Django Wexler's Thousand Names came out, which the pitch was very similar. But the fact is that even though we're both writing flintlock fantasy, our worlds are very different. Our magic is very different. So it's one of those balances where you've kind of got, you do worry a lot about that kind of thing, but you also, like, it's a big world. It's harder than you think to even accidentally rip off someone else.
Yeah.
Once you dig into the kind of the meat, pitches can sound very similar, but once you dig into the meat of a world, it's not nearly as hard. For me, I with the glass magic, I knew from probably 4 or 5 years ago when I first started thinking about this world, I knew that I wanted to involve glass somehow. I find glass making pretty fascinating. I thought it was kind of a cool medium. I hadn't heard of anyone else doing anything like that. And so I tossed around ideas for a good year or two before I actually landed on God Glass. But I knew I wanted to start with glass and work from there.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's cool to see. It's cool to see what you do with it in the books as just kind of a medium. I have to ask because this is the first time that I've read anything of yours. I think it's you have another series which I've read all of Powder Mage, but you have something else that you have written that I have not read, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. If you can remind me.
Is that Valkyrie Collections?
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so you have that, but really, I think the In the Shadow of Lightning. It's the first time where you've written something outside of the Powder Mage world for epic fantasy. Yes.
Yes, this
Okay.
is, I consider, so Valkyrie Collections is my kind of little urban fantasy series. I've only got two books out so far. And they're small. They're kind of, for me, they're kind of like palate cleansers to
Yeah.
write because, my normal thing is these massive books. Uh, and uh, and so yeah, this is my first time going outside of Powder Mage for kind of what I'm known for, which is honestly, it's a little bit nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
Like the last few days have been like, oh my gosh, are people going to like my next thing, right? So you kind of run into that whole, because when you're writing in a different genre, you're like, oh, I don't have as much investment in this. If
Right.
people don't like it, I move on. But like I am an epic fantasy writer. That is what I do for a living. It pays all my bills. And so yeah, it definitely has been, it's been really cool to be like, oh, I'm finally moving on to something new. I can see if I have the ability and readers have the patience to enter another awesome world of mine.
Well, and I wanted to ask you about that specifically because even if you were going into a different direction than Powder Mage, one, I just wanted to confirm there's no interconnectedness between these worlds. We're not going to find out later on that there's a glass portal somewhere that takes us to going and hanging out with Taniel and everybody in the Powder Mage world, right?
No, no, this isn't a oh, I just forgot this isn't a Cosmere situation.
Okay, yes. Well,
Um,
Cosmere, or and that's one of the reasons I want to ask is like, was there a temptation, as so many different authors these days, and also even in other work like Marvel, etc., where these things are all getting interconnected. Here you are writing the next world. Was there any moment in time where you're like, should these characters in these worlds be somehow interconnected? Should you be able to travel between these?
I mean, that was a temptation. Like it's something I definitely thought about because of what Brandon's doing, but also because of what Brandon's doing, it makes it something I don't like. We just talked about a moment ago. I don't want to rip it off. I don't want
Yeah,
to make it look like I'm trying to be a Brandon clone. And it's a very, even though like the idea of interconnected universes is used a lot, especially these days with Marvel and all that. Um, in terms of epic fantasy, it's such a specific thing that I kind of, I did think about it. It's
yeah.
a very tempting thing, and it's fun. It's fun to connect your worlds. But no, I decided to discard that idea.
Well, one of the things, and again, no spoilers for Powder Mage, but just a brief thing that I've noticed about two of the characters is I feel like Demir and Taniel have a lot in common. I feel like there's a lot of Taniel and Demir, and even though their personalities are a little different, it's a lot of situations where you have a younger dude, murdered mother, a bit of a savant with the magic, coming back after an adventure off in the boonies or someplace else. And so, how did you approach these two characters, and were you drawn to this specific archetype? Like, is that why we started to see, or why there's some of these similarities there? And in what ways did you make sure that they were very different?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely drawn to various archetypes, and sometimes it's subconscious. I don't even think about it. Like you mentioning kind of the vague outline of Taniel and Demir at the beginning of the book, like that had never even entered my head at any point. But you mentioned it, and yeah, that is quite similar in some ways. But I do like the idea of people who are kind of old for their age. Taniel and Demir probably much more than Taniel. But I like the idea of people that are old for their age because of what they've seen and what they've done, and that they've experienced the world, even if they're still pretty young. And And I do like the idea. You know, we all like the idea of these genius characters, these people that are really good at what they do. And I tend to do that across all my characters. Is they tend to be quite competent people. But yeah, and it focuses, you know, with some characters, it will focus on magic. And in that case, more Taniel than Demir. Demir is he's a glass dancer, which is the one innate magic in this world that lets him manipulate regular glass, basically glass-based telekinesis. And the thing with Demir is that in this world, glass dancers are these incredibly powerful, very feared people. They are people that take power rather than earn it. And Demir actually kind of kicks back against that. He's somebody who has a very deep sense of fairness and even kindness. Even though he's not necessarily a great person, but he really wants to be. And so he looks at this sorcery that he has naturally, that is it's very easy to kill with. And it makes you in this society, it makes you a person of note. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't like the way people look at him with fear. He's somebody who naturally he wants to be a politician. You know, his weapon of choice is being a charmer. You know, a smile, wink, you know, a little bit of cash on the side. He's somebody who does that kind of thing rather than really physical violence. And I liked the idea of a character who, you know, with Taniel, that's his job. You know, he kills people. He is a sniper essentially. Um, and Demir, I wanted to contrast that with somebody who doesn't really like that aspect of himself and pushes back actively against it and wants people to see him as someone who is there to help, someone who is there to make life better for everyone else. And that's a constant struggle for him.
Yeah. Most of the time when you have a hero or a main character who's a magic user or has some sort of special abilities or whatever, you know, it's a lot of the fun just comes from them using it even in everyday scenarios. One of the things that I do like about Demir and other characters like him, where there's almost like a sense of resignation whenever you see him have to get into the glass dancer mode, but it's really fun to read because you end up in the situations where you're like, okay, the gloves are coming off. Here we go. Some crazy stuff's going to happen. And because of just like I mean, I don't know who did your cover art, but the cover, it does such a good job of painting this like very cool visual. And I've looked at this often and thought of it as I'm imagining sort of the moment where like you get the glass shattering and Demir or another glass dancer has that hovering and these shards that are gonna, you know, just start to fuck people up for for lack of a better word. It is very fun to sort of have those moments where it's like, okay, here we go, it's happening. So
Yeah, and that's very, you know, with epic fantasy, it's almost I sometimes will compare it to kind of the anime moments. And epic fantasy has a lot of that. You
yeah,
gotta go for those moments of cool that are kind of there, even though it's a book. I don't know if this makes sense, but even though it's a book, it's very visually pleasing. Like
yeah.
somebody can envision this in their head very easily, and it's visceral, and I love that. Those payoffs are always very fun.
Well, Demir is not he's our main man, but there are some other really cool point of view characters. I don't know if you want to list those off for folks that might be more drawn to one of those.
Yeah. So we have Tessa Falier. She is a young genius magical engineer. She's a Siliseer, and she is basically she starts off the book as the protege of one of the leading masters of this world. And she's young, she's fairly idealistic, she's very good at what she does. She makes god glass. She makes it for specific situations. She's one of those people that you give her the right tools and you tell her to reach a conclusion, and she will get there eventually. Which was, you know, very fun to write in terms of kind of almost a more of a mathematical approach. She kind of she compares what she does as a mix of art and science, and we get to see God glass through her eyes, which makes the magic a little less abstract. and I liked doing that a lot.
Well, and
Um,
I really quickly, I know we're going to go on to the other characters, but I wanted to say it was something that was really cool to see because I think in Powder Mage, there's not. I'm trying to think if there are characters that do a lot of exploration of the magic, and I don't think that there are, which is cool because you just instead you have people just kind of like ramping up power and figuring stuff out as they go. But it was neat because I think this is one of the first times that I've read something you've written where you do get somebody who's like kind of diving into the mechanics of it.
yeah, very much so. And that was a conscious decision on my part. I That's not something I am practiced at as a writer. And so she was actually the hardest point of view to write for the book. But I put a lot of work into learning how to write a character that is slower and methodical and is exploring things rather than going out and punching people, right? Because when you're going out and punching people, it's very easy to write conflict, because lots of punching, right? But when you have a character whose work is in a workshop, she's literally an engineer, that it's harder to kind of balance that about against keeping the plot flowing and the narrative moving forward, and so that was quite a challenge, but one that I'm really glad I did.
Yeah, no, I mean it's really cool to see, and I think that getting to see her explore it, I think, has been it's one of the fun parts of the book for me. And then I think we have a couple more characters to round it out.
We do. So we have Idrian Spolky. Idrian is he's a breacher. He In my past books I've written a lot of military characters, officers, soldiers, people like that. I pared that back a bit for this series, but Idrian is our view into the military. And so he's something called a breacher. And in this kind of world of artillery and muskets and lines firing at each other, and you've got glass dancers who basically act as a artillery supplement, shooting glass up into the air to shower down at the enemy. Idrian is different. Idrian is literally sent to break the enemy lines. He wears god glass armor that's stronger than steel. He's got a massive shield and a massive sword. And he basically is sent across to just absolutely destroy the coherence of the enemy line. And he's very fun because, like I mentioned earlier, it's those anime moments, right? Adrian's the one in this series that I get to play with those anime moments the most. He is just he's absolutely a tank, but he's also a big softy. He's incredibly attached to his battalion, this group of crazy combat engineers that he basically rolls with, and and man, I love Adrian. He has that thing similar to Demir, where he's conflicted about the violence that he does for a living. He's more at peace with it than Demir is. He's been doing it a lot longer, but he also feels like the violence he does is for a purpose. He does it to protect the Empire. He does it to protect his friends, and it's a great kind of contrast to have the inner and the outer with a character like that.
Yeah. And then Kizzy, I believe, Russ.
Yes, Cassandra Vorsian. She actually was my favorite and easiest character to write. Cassandra she's somewhere in the middle with all of this. So she is an enforcer for one of the biggest, most powerful guild families in the world. And she's not just an enforcer, she is a bastard of the father, of the patriarch of this family. And so she is on the outside of an incredibly powerful family, but she's not legitimized. She's just a bastard. And so she doesn't have the privileges. She doesn't have all of the comforts that her family, her half siblings all have. She basically has to watch them live lives of luxury while she is with all of the other grunts doing the things that are nasty that keep the guild families in power. And she's very fun because we get to see her conflict, her inner conflict, but also she's the knife in the dark. She's the one who is there to slit throats, break knees, and kind of take care of business quietly. Part assassin, part middle manager sometimes. She is, like I said, she's an enforcer in a very mafia-esque sort of way.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned her in the houses, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is sort of, it's very common in fantasy to have kings and queens and sort of a royal government of sorts. And even if there's intrigue, it's like palace intrigue and that type of stuff. Whereas you went more with these kind of like guild families, which I thought was a very, I'm sure there are other examples of it in fantasy, but it's less frequent. So why did you decide to go that direction, and what kind of research or, cultures, different governments, et cetera, did you have to look into to figure out how to handle this? Because there are a lot of politics going on behind the scenes between these families.
Well, I basically took inspiration from a couple of different a couple of different Italian time periods. The first of which was the late Roman Republic. Demir's mother is directly influenced by the Gracchi, I'm going to say it wrong, the Gracchi brothers, I think, the two Gracchus, and who were reformers in the late Roman Republic, who kept trying to get the rest of the Senate to basically give some more rights to the people, and trying to equalize things a little bit in a very unequal society. And they were both murdered brutally by their fellow senators. And so Demir's mother is directly influenced by that. This idea of someone who is a reformer, someone who is very popular, and that does not protect them in the end.
Yeah.
And I kind of, in a similar vein with kind of that time period, and in fact many, like I said, many Italian time periods had a similar structure. You get more modern day as the mafia very directly, but you go back to the Renaissance, you've got like people like the Medicis, these big families that own huge swaths of the country and essentially run it, even if not in name. And I really loved that idea. And so I basically took that and I said, okay, we've got this massive, powerful empire. They haven't had an actual emperor for hundreds of years, and it's all run by this not really, kind of self-elected assembly that's made up of hundreds of different guild families. We only meet some of the most powerful ones in the book, but the idea is that this is this loose coalition of these kind of power-hungry families that all control the production of God glass. Their fingers are in every pie, and none of them are good people. And I liked kind of playing with that kind of aspect, especially with my characters. Something I've always done, back in Powder Mage, is that I love playing with characters who are not necessarily heroes in the way that we think of them. Ben Steik from the second Powder Mage trilogy, he is just an absolute monster of just a total murder rage machine. And he's not really a hero. And I like playing with that. And, we get to meet like people like Demir. Demir really wants to be a good person. He really wants to help people, but he also gets his hands very bloody at times. And that's fun to see, characters that are good people living in times where being good is definitely a disadvantage, and that's fun to navigate.
Yeah, no, I think that a lot of the situations that the characters get into in this are very fascinating, and kind of, you do a good job, and I won't get into any spoilers here, I think, of creating several interesting mysteries throughout it, around like, well, why is this happening? Or what is the deal here? Or you'll have somebody sneaky outside of a window and you'll be like, what the heck is that? When is that going to come back? So it's been a joy to read the book and get through it. And it's been fun to dive into another universe that you've written, because similar, you had basically only written Powder Mage in the epic fantasy world. And so that was similarly to the only thing you'd written, the only thing I'd read from you. So it's fun to see what you're doing in this world. I'm looking forward to more. Where can people find out, or where can people find copies of this? Do you have recommended purchase locations? Or I saw somebody in the chat was very excited to find it on Audible just now.
Yeah, it should be pretty much everywhere. There's if you're in the UK or Australia, you might not be able to get the hardcover until the end of July. But in terms of ebook, audiobook, very easy to get. Should be easy to get anywhere that English territories sell books.
Awesome.
And those are both out already. Hardcovers out in the US and Canada. If you want signed copies, you can get them from my website directly. And yeah, so it's available and easy to get.
Go purchase it, I guess, is what is the main message here. Um, well, again, thank you so much for talking with me today. For folks who want to, obviously, we spoke a lot about the new book, but if folks want to learn a little bit more about Powder Mage, I did a video on my YouTube channel where I talk a little bit about what I liked about that, and if people want to learn more about that, they can do so there. And then also, if you're watching this live on Twitch, you can make sure if you missed any of it, you can catch this. It'll be up on the Fantasy Book YouTube channel that I have in just a day or two. So again, Brian, thank you so much for coming and talking with me today online.
Of course, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Have a good one.